Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and we are a week away from Election Day 2025. So this week, we're zooming in on the biggest contests of the year. Today, it's Virginia and New Jersey. We'll also check out the latest polling in California's redistricting proposition. And then later in the week, we're going to take a detailed tour of how New York City's vastly different neighborhoods are coming down in the mayoral race. But today, we'll start in Virginia, where Democrat Abigail Spanberger currently leads Republican Winsome Earl-Sears in the race for governor by an average of 8 points. Underneath that, though, there's plenty of variation, with recent polls ranging from a 5-point lead to a 13-point lead for Spanberger. And the Attorney General's race, in which Democrat Jay Jones has had to apologize for text messages that promoted political violence, is significantly closer. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, Democrat Mikey Sherrill leads Republican Jack Ciattarelli by 6 points on average. Most polls there have shown a mid-single-digit race. In the legislatures in both states, Democrats appear assured to maintain their majorities or grow them. We're also going to take a closer look at some specific parts of Virginia and New Jersey that could give us some indication of how parts of the electorate are reacting to Trump 2.0. They're the wealthy Northern Virginia and Northern Jersey suburbs, large Hispanic communities also in Northern Jersey, large Black communities in Hampton Roads. So we have a lot to cover, and if you stick around, we might even get to the latest Graham-Plattner polling in Maine. Here with me to do it all is Chaz Nuttycombe, Executive Director of State Navigate, which covers state-level politics around the country from a data perspective. Welcome, Chaz. It's so great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Mary Radcliffe, who everybody already knows, but who also works at State Navigate, and as of a couple weeks ago, also runs the polling aggregation site 50+1. So welcome, Mary, and a big congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's been a whirlwind couple of weeks. We're really excited to be up, and 50+1 will have a ton of new stuff coming your way soon. We are continuing to build and take into account people's suggestions, and I'm just so thrilled.
Mary, nothing can stop you from aggregating every single poll in America on the internet. I don't know where the limits of your polling knowledge are, but they're quite broad.
I mean, mostly the internet. I don't have all the newspapers.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's begin with Virginia. State Navigate actually has a forecast of the race, which projects Abigail Spanberger wins 98% of the time with a projected margin of 11 points. So with that, let's move on to New Jersey. No, I'm kidding. In all seriousness, Chaz, tell me a little bit about why this race appears to be so wrapped up, the Virginia governor's race.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been since 1977 that Virginia has always elected a governor opposite of the incumbent presidential party, with the exception of 2013, of course, when Terry McAuliffe, who's a Democrat running against Republican Ken Cuccinelli, won while Barack Obama was in the beginning of his second term. That's the only exception. So there's a lot of history here. There's also, I think, kind of contributing to this race and why it just seems especially much more likely in terms of forecasting and polling and whatnot as well, right? Compared to 2017 during Trump's first term, right? Is I think there's a big difference in candidate quality. Ed Gillespie, I think you beat Corey Stewart in the primary. Corey Stewart was a very hardline kind of MAGA Republican who narrowly lost to Gillespie in the gubernatorial primary in 2017, only for Gillespie to run kind of very Corey Stewart-esque ads talking about MS-13 and everything. I think that was their main attack ad. Not really looking like she's going to do as well on persuasion as Gillespie was. Obviously, Northam had a little bit of a narrow advantage on the persuasion. I think most polling had Northam, or looking at the electorate, Northam probably won independents and or moderates, whatever, probably 2-1. I would say probably with Spanberger it's probably somewhere in that range as well, but I would say probably closer to 70-30 in what Spanberger is going to be getting with independents. And it just comes down to persuasion. There's also the environment, of course. I mean, look, there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about with presidential approval, right? Trump was popular at the start of his term just narrowly, and now he's down at least high single digits in approval. And then we can talk about party ID changing as well, right? Gallup Q3 2024 was R+1 when pushing leaners, right? They have they ask, are you a Democrat, independent, or Republican? And then they ask in the second question, for the independents, which one do you lean towards? And so it's like R+1 then. Q3 this year is D+7, if I recall correctly, which is actually higher than what Democrats had in Q3 in 2017. And for context on Q4, it was like R+5 in 2021. That was, of course, after the Afghanistan withdrawal, a whole bunch of things that led to Glenn Youngkin's victory in 2021.
Okay, so you
So, yeah.
set the scene pretty clearly here for an environment that is favorable to Democrats and also a dynamic between the two candidates that is favorable to Democrats. Nonetheless, we're seeing a decent amount of polling variation, as I mentioned in the intro. As I also mentioned in the intro, Mary has been tracking all of it. What I didn't mention is that State Navigate also conducted its own poll in Virginia, which was one of the strongest performances for Abigail Spanberger, showing her leading by 13 points over Winsome Earl Sears. So, Mary, I want to talk to you a little bit about methodology here. So, first, I should say polling variation is not a bad thing. In fact, if you've been listening to this podcast or its forebearer for a while, you know that sometimes when all of the polls suggest the same result, we worry about hurting, and that pollsters sort of are trying to cut their losses and maybe play it a little conservative by tweaking things that get the expected result. And that can sometimes lead to an inaccurate polling average instead of an accurate polling average. So it's fine that the ranges in terms of how much Abigail Spanberger is leading by range from, say, like 5 to 13 percentage points. But Mary, in talking before we got on today, you suggested that there are methodological differences in how those polls are being conducted that may say something about where you expect at least this race to fall.
Yeah. There's this really interesting thing happening in the Virginia polling. You can sort of split the polls into two buckets. There's like a bucket of polls that show Spanberger leading by high single digits into low double digits. That includes, of course, State Navigate's poll, but also like the recent poll conducted by Washington Post and the George Mason University, which had Spanberger ahead by 12, and some others. And then there's another bucket of polls that show this as a mid to low single digits race. And there's a key methodological distinction between these buckets of polls, which I find really interesting happening in Virginia, which is how you benchmark the partisanship of the electorate in 2025. So there's a number of pollsters that are sort of mystifyingly to me weighting their demographics to the 2021 exit poll, which seems crazy because it seems like, as Chaz was describing with partisan affiliation changes that you see in Gallup, with the history we know of how turnout looks in Virginia in these off-year elections, to expect that the demographics of the electorate in 2025 would resemble the demographics of the electorate in 2021 during the Biden presidency, again, post-Afghanistan withdrawal. These should be two very different electorates. So what's especially notable, though, is even among surveys that are benchmarking to the 2021 exit polls in Virginia, Spanberger is still leading. Right. So even if you imagine the electorate to look just like it did in 2021, which it will not, pollsters still are not getting Winsome Earl Sears ahead. So I think that's sort of what's in the background of this polling, is this methodological distinction where pollsters are thinking about the electorate in two different ways, giving two different types of results. All that being said, my expectation for this race is probably closer to that high single digits, low double digits. State Navigate's survey had it at 13 points. That might be a bit high, but there's a bunch of other surveys that have it at 9, 10 points. I think that's probably the ballpark that I would expect.
Yeah, to your point about how we expect the electorate to change, I mean, what do Spanberger's and Winsome Earl Sears's coalitions look like?
One thing that's really unique that our poll found was Spanberger when we broke down people by income, Spanberger's making a lot of gains relative to 2024 presidential margin, looking at polling and everything, with the lowest income voters. And I think the reason why that is because Spanberger has made the cost of living the focal point of her campaign. Bob Holsworth, a very famous Richmond-based political analyst, been around for 3-4 decades now, had an article out today that kind of made this point on how Republicans pretty much cut their losses in the gubernatorial race since the summer. They want to save Attorney General Jason Miyares. If he can just get across the finish line, then they have somebody to run in 2029 who's an incumbent to run for governor. Maybe the Democrats have the White House and that Virginia tradition continues, and then we get Governor Miyares, right? And then, so Spanberger's focal point has been the economy and cost of living. That's been just the number one thing she's been talking about on her ads and in messaging and everything. Whereas Winsome Sears has really tried to just get red meat out to the base, and that red meat is transgender policies. This is especially, I would say the area where it's most salient, I guess, would be in Northern Virginia. There was a sex offender who was a registered sex offender who was arrested in a public school in Arlington County, having identified as a woman. This was toward the beginning of the year. Republicans have really been harping on that, hoping that they can catch fire like they did in 2021 with this kind of separate story in Loudoun County that really energized the base. So I think Sears is really just looking to get as many strong Republicans out as she can rather than winning on persuasion. Whereas I think if I were to say, I would say Spanberger is focused more on persuasion than the base. But what I will say is that when you look at the early voting numbers, I mean, Richmond metropolitan area, the media market is just coming out for this thing in droves, which is good for Spanberger because that's where she's from. That's where her base is. Our poll had the Richmond media market swinging 14 points to the left from 2024. Interestingly enough, Northern Virginia, even though everybody's talking about Doge, only swinging 7 points to the left, and Hampton Roads just about even. Right? Those are the three big, we call it the urban crescent. So those are the big, areas in Virginia.
And just to break down what that means in maybe layman's terms, people are focused on Northern Virginia because, yes, it's a lot of federal employees and also wealthier suburbs of DC. So when people talk about Northern Virginia, they're talking about, maybe parts of the country that were ancestrally Republican that have swung significantly to the left since Trump's ascent. And then Hampton Roads is Black voters. So it's maybe notable here to say that we are seeing continued shifts to the left amongst sort of the wealthier, better educated voters and people who maybe, are more affected by a government shutdown and Doge cuts from earlier in the year. And then also, of course, Richmond, which maybe has some similar characteristics, but also has to do with candidate quality. But that it doesn't seem like Abigail Spanberger is overperforming with Black voters compared with Harris in 2024.
I think Spanberger was definitely in difficult territory with, I think there was a lot of speculation, even with Black leaders in Virginia, especially, I think this is part of the reason why Senate President pro tempore Louise Lucas wanted Bobby Scott to run for governor and not Abigail Spanberger, right? There was all that hubbub toward the beginning of the year, but that Abigail Spanberger would have difficulty with turning out Black voters. She's doing great with turning out Black voters in Richmond. And Black voters in Hampton Roads do seem to be lacking. But one thing I do want to add here is that if you go to statenavigate.org/Virginia, we have a tracker that shows as of this day, 1 year ago, how many early votes were there in 2024, how many early votes are there today by mail and everything. And you break down that as a percentage. Hampton Roads, Black areas do seem to be lacking. And I think that is part of why President Barack Obama is going to be coming to Norfolk to campaign for Spanberger. I would say the biggest demographic issue for Abigail Spanberger are Asian voters, particularly in Loudoun County. And I think this is where the one area where Winsome Sears just really harping on the whole transgender issue is going to work. Asian voters, particularly in Loudoun, these are Muslim voters, these are Indian American voters, right? Are pretty socially conservative, but, they are traditionally Democratic. And I mean, look, when we talk about Loudoun County, we think about last year, pretty much anybody who knew how to read results when Loudoun County dropped everything at 7:30 p.m. knew that Donald Trump was going to be president. I think another aspect for why Loudoun County Asian turnout is lacking is because you got a whole bunch of freshman delegates in there who I don't think are really campaigning as hard as some of these other longer term incumbents in safe Democratic seats. But I would say, and look, we are working on this final State Navigate poll that will be out the Saturday before Election Day. And we're going to ask about the top issues. I would say probably the transgender issue probably ranks about as high as it does with white voters as it does in Asian voters. But, we're probably going to have a pretty small N on, the Asian sample in that. So take with it what you will. But I think that is something that is worth watching for. Youth voters are also really interesting. I think there's been a whole bunch of hubbub, around like, is it the youngest Gen Z, right? Trump won 18-year-olds by 1 point last year, according to David Shore. Is Gen Z like very conservative, or are they just